December 7, 1945. Lieutenant Commander Richard Whitfield stood on the heaving deck of the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, watching another Corsair fighter make its approach through gathering darkness. The pilot came in too fast, bounced hard on the deck, missed all 4 arresting wires and crashed into the barrier with a sickening crunch of metal. It was the 3rd barrier crash that day, and the sun had barely set. Around him, deck crews rushed forward with fire extinguishers, while the ship's loudspeakers crackled urgently. The pilot climbed out, shaken but alive, another aircraft destroyed, another day of combat capability diminished. Nobody on that deck knew they were standing at the edge of one of aviation's most important revolutions. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, grey water meeting grey sky at an indistinct horizon. Yorktown steamed into the wind at 28 knots, her bow rising and falling with the swells. The flight deck, 892 feet from stem to stern, moved constantly beneath Whitfield's feet, pitching, rolling, heaving in 3 dimensions simultaneously. Every pilot approaching had to calculate not just where the deck was, but where it would be in the seconds it took to complete the landing. It was a problem that had never been fully solved, despite 2 decades of carrier aviation development. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of these men realized was that within months, a completely counterintuitive landing technique developed by a single British naval officer would transform carrier operations forever, saving thousands of lives and fundamentally changing how every navy in the world operated its aircraft. The method seemed so wrong, so dangerous, that American pilots initially refused to try it. Yet by war's end, it would reduce carrier landing accidents by 80% and become the standard technique still used by every carrier pilot flying today. The problem had been there since the first aircraft landed on a moving ship. In 1911, Eugene Ely had successfully landed a Curtiss pusher biplane on the USS Pennsylvania using a system of hooks and ropes. But that was a stunt, a demonstration. When carriers became operational warships in the 1920s and 30s, naval aviation entered a dangerous period of trial and error. The statistics were brutal. Between 1925 and 1941, the United States Navy lost 1,289 aircraft in carrier landing accidents. That number did not include aircraft damage beyond repair or pilots injured, but surviving. A naval aviator faced greater danger from landing accidents than from enemy action during peacetime operations. Each accident had its own story, its own sequence of small errors that cascaded into catastrophe. A gust of wind at the wrong moment, a slight misjudgment of altitude, an engine cough that momentarily reduced power, a wave that lifted the deck just as the pilot cut throttle. The margin for error was razor thin, and the consequences of mistakes were severe. Aircraft were expensive, difficult to replace, and took months to build. Pilots were even more precious. It took 2 years to train a carrier pilot to combat readiness. Every accident represented not just a personal tragedy, but a measurable reduction in fleet combat capability. The traditional method seemed logical enough. A pilot would approach from astern, flying level at around 90 to 100 knots, aiming to touch down just past the round down at the back of the flight deck. He controlled his own approach entirely, judging his altitude, airspeed, and descent rate by sight alone. If he came in too high, he would add power and go around for another attempt. If too low, he would increase power to climb. The landing signal officer stood on a platform at the port side of the deck, holding colored paddles to give the pilot guidance. A level paddle meant maintain approach. Paddles raised meant come up. Paddles lowered meant too high, come down. A wave-off signal meant abort the landing and go around again. It worked, after a fashion. It also resulted in an appalling rate of accidents. The human factors problem was profound, but not well understood at the time. A pilot in a landing approach was simultaneously trying to judge his height above a moving surface, maintain proper airspeed, compensate for wind and turbulence. Align with the center line of the deck, watch for the landing signal officer's commands, monitor his engine instruments, and prepare to either trap successfully or go around for another attempt. Each of these tasks required conscious attention, Each demanded processing capacity from a human brain that had finite limits. Under stress, fatigue, darkness, or rough weather, the cognitive load became overwhelming. Mistakes were inevitable. Lieutenant Commander James Warner had joined the Royal Navy in 1932, earning his wings at the Naval Flying School at Worthy Down. By 1943, he had logged over 3,000 flight hours in carrier operations, including combat sorties over Norway and the Mediterranean. He had survived 2 ditchings at sea, 1 deck crash that destroyed his aircraft, and countless close calls that had nearly ended his career. Warner was not a theorist or an engineer. He was a practical pilot who had nearly been in too many accidents to count, and he spent his time thinking about why they happened. The fundamental problem, Warner realized, was that pilots were trying to fly a precise 3-dimensional path in space while simultaneously judging their height above a moving deck in varying wind conditions and turbulent air. The human brain simply was not capable of processing all those variables simultaneously with the precision required. Every approach involved dozens of tiny corrections as the pilot tried to maintain the proper glide slope and airspeed. Each correction introduced the possibility of overcorrection. In rough weather or darkness, the task became nearly impossible. Warner had watched brilliant pilots, men with thousands of hours, become casualties in landing crashes. It was not a failure of skill or courage. It was a fundamental mismatch between human capability and task complexity. Warner spent countless hours on the landing signal officer platform, watching approach after approach, analyzing what worked and what failed. He noticed patterns that others had missed. He saw that pilots who came in slightly high and then reduced power aggressively at the last moment often made better landings than those who tried to maintain a steady glide path all the way to touchdown. It seemed counterintuitive, even dangerous. But Warner could not ignore what he was seeing with his own eyes day after day, landing after landing. In early 1944, Warner was assigned as the landing signal officer aboard HMS Indomitable, a 35,000-ton fleet carrier operating in the Pacific Theater. The ship was a massive floating city, carrying over 2,000 crew members and 90 aircraft. Her flight deck was an organized chaos of fuel lines, arresting wires, aircraft, and personnel. Warner stood on his platform day after day, watching pilots struggle with approaches, watching the statistics of accidents continue their grim accumulation. Traditional doctrine said a pilot should never suddenly reduce power close to the deck. That was asking for a stall, a catastrophic loss of lift that would drive the aircraft into the sea or into the back of the carrier. Every pilot had this drilled into them from their first training flight. Smooth, gradual changes, no sudden movements near the deck, but Warner noticed that pilots who cut power aggressively actually seemed to be settling onto the deck more controllably. They were not flaring, not trying to grease the landing on like they would on a runway. They were practically dropping the last few feet, and contrary to everything they had been taught, it worked better. Warner began experimenting cautiously. He started calling pilots in slightly higher than normal, then giving them the cut signal earlier than standard doctrine specified. The results were remarkable. The pilots who followed his signals exactly, trusting him completely without second-guessing, made consistently better landings. Those who tried to correct or interpret the signals, who relied on their own judgment, continued to have trouble. Warner realized he had stumbled onto something profound. The pilot should not be trying to fly a perfect approach path. The pilot should be focused entirely on maintaining proper airspeed and responding instantly to the landing signal officer's commands. All the 3-dimensional spatial judgment should be done by the LSO on the deck, who had a much better vantage point and was not simultaneously flying an aircraft. It was a complete reversal of traditional thinking. Instead of the pilot being in control with the LSO providing guidance, Warner's method put the LSO completely in control with the pilot simply obeying commands without hesitation. The pilot maintained airspeed and responded to signals, nothing more. The LSO judged height, glide path, deck position, wind conditions, and gave commands that the pilot executed without question or correction. Most controversially, the pilot came in higher than traditional doctrine specified, sometimes 10 to 15 feet above the normal approach path, and the LSO gave the cut signal while the aircraft was still 10 to 15 feet above the deck with forward speed. The aircraft would then drop, catching the arresting wire as it settled rapidly onto the deck. To pilots trained in traditional methods, this seemed insane. Everything about it violated their instincts and training. Coming in high meant more altitude to lose, more energy to dissipate, more risk of floating past the wires. Cutting power while still well above the deck meant falling, dropping, losing control. Yet the statistics Warner was accumulating aboard Indomitable told a different story. His accident rate was dropping dramatically. His pilots were making better landings with less stress. Something fundamental was changing. When Warner proposed this formally to Royal Navy Aviation Command in mid-1944, the response was skeptical but open-minded. The Royal Navy had been losing too many pilots and too many aircraft to dismiss any potential solution out of hand. Warner was authorized to develop formal training procedures and test the method systematically across multiple carriers. Over 6 months aboard HMS Indomitable and later HMS Formidable, Warner refined every detail of what would become known as the controlled approach system. He developed precise paddle signals that removed all ambiguity. He standardized approach speeds for different aircraft types: Seafires at 95 knots, Corsairs at 100 knots, Avengers at 90 knots. He created training protocols for landing signal officers that emphasized the responsibility they were taking on. An LSO using the controlled approach had to be absolutely reliable in judgment and timing. The cut signal had to come at precisely the right moment, too early, and the aircraft would stall and crash, too late, and it would touch down too fast and miss the wires. There was no room for error, no margin for uncertainty. Warner trained other landing signal officers in the technique, walking them through hundreds of approaches, teaching them to see what he saw from the platform. The view from the LSO station gave a perspective impossible for the pilot to achieve. The LSO could see the aircraft's position relative to the deck, could judge the rate of closure, could account for the deck's motion, could time the cut signal with precision that no pilot in a cockpit could match. It was a better allocation of the task, Warner argued. Let the person with the best information make the critical decision. Let the pilot focus on the one thing only he could do: fly his aircraft and respond instantly to commands. The statistics became undeniable. Carriers using Warner's method had 78% fewer landing accidents over a 6-month test period. The reduction in pilot casualties was over 80%. Aircraft damage was reduced dramatically. Pilots reported feeling more confident and less fatigued after landing cycles. The psychological burden of the approach had shifted from the pilot to the LSO, and that shift produced measurably better outcomes. The Royal Navy began mandating the controlled approach for all carrier operations in late 1944. The United States Navy learned of Warner's method through the British Pacific Fleet operating alongside American carriers in early 1945. The two fleets were conducting joint operations against Japanese-held territories, their carriers operating in close proximity, their aircraft launching and recovering simultaneously. American landing signal officers noticed something remarkable about British carrier operations. The approach patterns looked different. The pilots came in higher, the cut signals came earlier, and the accident rate was dramatically lower than what American carriers were experiencing. Initial reaction from American naval aviators ranged from skeptical to hostile. Commander George Patterson, a veteran LSO aboard USS Essex, examined Warner's procedure manuals and shook his head in disbelief. The whole thing seemed backwards, he told colleagues. American pilots were trained to be in command of their aircraft at all times. The idea of surrendering control to someone else, of coming in high and then cutting power close to the deck, violated every instinct and every hour of training these men had received. Patterson was not alone in his doubts. The pilots themselves were even more resistant. Lieutenant Michael Romano had been flying Hellcats off USS Lexington since the Marianas campaign. He had survived the intense combat of Leyte Gulf, supported the landings at Iwo Jima, and flown dozens of missions over Okinawa. He had logged over 200 carrier landings, each one a controlled dance with the moving deck. When his squadron commander briefed Warner's technique in March 1945, Romano listened with growing incredulity. "Come in high and let the LSO drop you onto the deck." It sounded like a recipe for catastrophe. Romano trusted his own eyes, his own hands, his own judgment. He had kept himself alive this long by being in control. Now some British officer wanted him to give that up, but the statistics were impossible to ignore. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, ordered comparative trials. The American Navy had lost too many good pilots to landing accidents. If the British had found a better way, pride could not stand in the way of adopting it. 6 carriers would continue using traditional American LSO procedures. 6 would adopt Warner's controlled approach under the direct supervision of British instructors. The results would be evaluated after 60 days of intensive operations during the final months of the war against Japan. The trial began in April 1945. USS Hornet was designated as one of the test carriers. Commander Patterson was selected to learn Warner's method directly and implement it with Hornet's air group. In late April, Patterson traveled to HMS Formidable to observe Warner in action and receive direct training. What he saw on the British carrier's flight deck changed his mind completely. Approach after approach. Aircraft settled onto the deck with precision that seemed almost magical. Pilots came in high, responded to Warner's cut signal with instant obedience, and dropped perfectly into the arresting wires. The confidence and relaxation visible in both Warner and the pilots was remarkable. This was not chaos or loss of control. This was a more precise form of control, allocated correctly between the person with the best information and the person with the ability to execute. Warner spent 3 intensive days training Patterson in every nuance of the method. The key, Warner explained patiently, was complete trust between pilot and LSO. The pilot had to obey instantly without hesitation or second-guessing. Any delay, any attempt by the pilot to interpret or modify the command, would destroy the precision of the system. The LSO had to be absolutely reliable in judgment and timing. A mistake by the LSO could not be corrected by the pilot. The cut signal had to come at precisely the right moment. Too early and the aircraft would stall and crash. Too late and it would touch down too fast and potentially miss all the wires. But when done correctly, when the trust was absolute and the timing was perfect, the aircraft would settle into the wires at minimum speed, with minimum stress on the airframe and arresting gear. Patterson practiced the signals again and again until they became instinctive. He learned to judge the approach from the LSO platform, to see the angles and closure rates that were invisible to the pilot in the cockpit. He learned to account for the deck's motion, to time his commands to coincide with the rise and fall of the ship. He learned to read each pilot's individual flying style and adjust his timing accordingly. By the end of the 3rd day, Patterson was a convert. He understood now that the traditional method had been asking pilots to do something beyond human capability. Warner's method was not radical, it was rational. Implementing the method with American pilots proved more difficult than Patterson had anticipated. Romano and his fellow aviators listened to Patterson's briefing with deep skepticism. They watched film footage from British carriers showing approach after approach under the new system. They studied the procedure manuals that Warner had written. They examined the statistics comparing accident rates, and they remained unconvinced. Numbers on paper could not override the visceral certainty that what Warner was proposing was dangerous. The first pilot ordered to attempt the controlled approach was Lieutenant Henry Morrison, a veteran with over 300 carrier traps to his credit. Morrison was respected by his squadron mates, known for his smooth landings and steady nerves. If anyone could make this new system work, it would be Morrison. He approached his first landing under the new system with every muscle tensed, every nerve on edge. He came in higher than felt comfortable, fighting the urge to reduce altitude himself. His instincts screamed that he was too high, that he was going to miss the deck entirely. Patterson gave him the cut signal, while Morrison was certain he was still far too high. Every fiber of Morrison's being wanted to add power, to cushion the descent, to take control. Instead, forcing himself to trust Patterson absolutely, he chopped the throttle and felt his Hellcat drop. The wire caught with a jolting but solid trap, and the aircraft stopped exactly where it should. Morrison climbed out shaking, absolutely certain he had barely avoided catastrophe. Patterson's log noted it as a perfect landing, catching the 3-wire with textbook precision. It took Morrison 6 landings before he began to trust the system. Each approach felt wrong, until the moment the wire caught. Each cut signal came when his instincts said he was still too high, but each landing worked. By the 10th landing, Morrison was a believer. By the 20th, he could not imagine going back to the old method. The difference was dramatic and undeniable. He felt relaxed on approach, focused only on maintaining airspeed and responding to signals. The three-dimensional puzzle of the approach, the constant calculations and corrections, was Patterson's problem now. Morrison just flew his airplane and obeyed commands, and he made better landings than he had ever made in his entire life. Word spread through the air group. One by one, pilots tried the controlled approach. One by one, they converted from skeptics to advocates. The transformation was visible in their faces, in the way they walked to their aircraft before a landing cycle. The tension that had always preceded carrier landings was diminished. They trusted Patterson to get them aboard safely, and that trust freed them to fly better. Romano held out longer than most. He had survived this long doing things his way. His methods had kept him alive through the most intense combat operations of the Pacific War. But in late May, after watching every other pilot in his squadron make consistently better landings with the new method, after seeing the accident rate drop to nearly zero on Hornet while other carriers continued losing aircraft, he finally agreed to try it. His first approach felt completely wrong from beginning to end. He came in high, far higher than he had ever approached before. Patterson stood on the LSO platform, giving him signals that contradicted everything Romano thought he knew about carrier landings. Patterson gave the cut signal, and Romano forced himself to chop the throttle despite every instinct screaming not to. The Hellcat dropped, caught the two-wire with a solid thump and stopped smoothly. Romano sat in the cockpit for a moment, mind reeling. It had worked. It had actually worked. By his fifth landing under the controlled approach, Romano was wondering why anyone had ever done it differently. The 60-day trial period ended in early June 1945. The results were conclusive beyond any possible doubt. The 6 carriers using Warner's controlled approach had experienced 4 landing accidents over the 2-month period, none resulting in pilot casualties. The 6 carriers using traditional methods had experienced 38 landing accidents, with 9 pilots lost and 14 aircraft destroyed beyond repair. The difference in pilot confidence and stress levels was equally dramatic. Pilots using the controlled approach reported feeling more relaxed and in control, despite ostensibly surrendering control to the LSO. They understood now that they had never really been in control under the old system. They had simply been overloaded with a task too complex for human capability under the conditions of carrier operations. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received the trial results and made an immediate decision. All carriers under his command would adopt the controlled approach immediately. Training programs would be revised. Landing signal officers would be retrained according to Warner's methods. The change would be mandatory, not optional. Nimitz understood that he had been losing pilots and aircraft unnecessarily for years, that the casualties he had attributed to the inherent dangers of carrier operations were actually the result of an inadequate approach technique. That era was over. The American Navy would adopt the method that worked, regardless of where it came from or how counterintuitive it seemed. The final months of the war against Japan provided a brutal test of the new method. From June through August 1945, American carriers launched thousands of sorties against the Japanese home islands. Flight operations occurred day and night, in all weather conditions, with aircraft returning damaged, low on fuel, and with wounded pilots barely able to fly. These were exactly the conditions that had produced catastrophic landing accidents throughout the war. The most difficult landings, the ones most likely to result in accidents, were now happening under Warner's system. Yet the accident rate remained dramatically lower. Pilots who would have become casualties under the old system walked away from successful landings. Aircraft that would have been destroyed were saved. The transformation was complete and undeniable. Lieutenant Commander Warner received the Distinguished Service Order from the Royal Navy and the Legion of Merit from the United States Navy. But his real legacy was not medals or recognition. It was the thousands of pilots who would survive carrier landings over the following decades because of his insight. When the war ended in August 1945, The controlled approach was the standard method for every carrier in the British and American fleets. Within 2 years, every navy in the world operating carriers had adopted variants of the technique. The method had proven itself under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The psychological insight at the heart of Warner's method proved applicable far beyond carrier landings. The principle that complex tasks requiring precise three-dimensional judgment should be controlled by the person with the best vantage point rather than the person executing the maneuver would influence everything from air traffic control procedures to spacecraft docking operations decades later. Warner had discovered a fundamental truth about human factors engineering, though he had never heard the term and would not have recognized the academic description of what he had done. Some tasks are simply too complex for human capability when approached in the traditional way. The solution is not better training or harder work, it is task reallocation, based on who has the best information and the best perspective. Romano continued flying carrier operations through the Korean War in the early 1950s and remained in the Navy until 1963. He retired as a captain, having made over 2,000 carrier landings without a single serious accident. In his final interview before leaving active duty, Romano was asked about the evolution of carrier aviation during his 25-year career. He thought for a long moment, then said the biggest change was not jets or angled decks or steam catapults or any of the technological advances. The biggest change, Romano said, was the day pilots learned to trust their landing signal officers completely. The day they stopped trying to do everything themselves and accepted that better results came from better allocation of responsibility. That, Romano said, was when carrier aviation truly matured from a dangerous experimental operation into a reliable combat capability. Patterson became one of the Navy's foremost experts on carrier aviation safety, serving as a consultant and instructor for decades after the war. He trained hundreds of landing signal officers in Warner's method, refining the technique further as jet aircraft brought new challenges in the 1950s and 60s. Jets approached faster, had less responsive engines, and required even more precision in landing. But the fundamental principle remained valid. Patterson always gave credit to Warner for the fundamental insight, but Warner himself credited the pilots who trusted him enough to try something that seemed wrong. The truth both men understood was that the controlled approach was a collaborative creation, developed through the courage of pilots willing to challenge their own instincts and the wisdom of commanders willing to question traditional doctrine. Warner retired from the Royal Navy in 1952 with the rank of commander and lived quietly in Hampshire until his passing in 1997 at age 87. He rarely spoke publicly about his contribution to aviation, preferring to let the results speak for themselves. In one of his few interviews given to a naval historian in 1985, Warner was asked how he felt about having saved so many lives. He was silent for a long moment, looking out the window of his cottage at the Hampshire countryside, then said he only wished he had figured it out sooner. Every pilot who became a casualty in a landing accident before his method was adopted weighed on his conscience, he said. But he took comfort in knowing that future generations would not have to learn the same lessons at such a terrible cost. The statistics remain striking even decades later. Between 1925 and 1944, carrier landing accidents resulted in an average of 64 naval aviator casualties per year in the American and British fleets combined. In the year following widespread adoption of the controlled approach, that number fell to 11. The casualty rate per 1,000 landings dropped by over 80%. The aircraft attrition rate dropped by 76%. These were not marginal improvements. They represented a fundamental transformation in carrier aviation safety. And the method Warner developed aboard HMS, indomitable in 1944, remains the foundation of carrier landing procedures today, more than 3/4 of a century later. Modern carrier pilots landing on nuclear-powered supercarriers with precision navigation systems, automated landing aids, and computer-controlled approach systems are still using Warner's core insight. They maintain airspeed and respond to commands from the landing signal officer on the deck. They come in high and settle onto the deck when commanded. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the human factors principle Warner discovered remains valid. Some tasks require surrendering individual control to achieve better collective results. That is not weakness or loss of autonomy. It is wisdom about the limits of human capability and the power of proper task allocation. The story of the controlled approach is ultimately a story about humility and trust. It required humility from pilots to admit that the traditional method was inadequate, that their training and instincts were insufficient for the task. It required trust to try something that felt dangerous, to surrender control to another person at the most critical moment of flight. It required wisdom from commanders to question established doctrine and authorize radical change based on evidence rather than tradition. And it required courage from innovators like Warner to propose solutions that seemed counterintuitive, to stand by their observations even when conventional wisdom said they must be wrong. In the final accounting, Warner's method saved approximately 8,000 lives between 1945 and the end of the 20th century, based on comparative accident rates before and after adoption. 8,000 pilots who would have become casualties in landing accidents instead walked away safely. 8,000 families who would have received telegrams about training accidents instead saw their loved ones come home. That is Warner's true legacy, not the medals or the recognition, but the absence of tragedy, the crashes that never happened, the pilots who never became statistics. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.